What if I told you that long before the Greeks, long before Rome, there was an empire so powerful it rivaled Egypt itself, yet it vanished so completely that the world forgot it even existed? Welcome to the journey of the Hittites. In this first part, we'll follow their story from mysterious beginnings in the Anatolian highlands to their rise as one of the most formidable powers of the ancient world. We'll walk through their myths of creation, their early kings, their first battles, and the foundations of an empire that would soon stand shoulder to shoulder with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. This is not just history, it's the rediscovery of a forgotten civilization. Long before steel bridges, modern skyscrapers, and digital machines shaped our world, human history was already being transformed by something far simpler, yet infinitely more powerful: fire and metal. These were not just tools, they were the foundations of civilizations. And among the many peoples who experimented with the mysteries of fire and earth, one group rose to prominence and changed the course of history: the Hittites. The Hittites were an ancient people who lived in Anatolia, a land that today is mostly within modern Turkey. Their homeland was a rugged plateau, surrounded by mountains, fertile valleys, and rivers that carried the lifeblood of trade and agriculture. This geography shaped their destiny. Unlike Egypt, with its predictable Nile, or Mesopotamia, with its famous rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Hittites had to adapt to harsher conditions. Their land demanded resilience, innovation, and above all, the courage to experiment with nature itself. From the very beginning, fire was their constant companion. To the Hittites, fire was more than warmth or light. It was a bridge between the human and the divine. In their myths, fire was sacred, an eternal flame that linked them to the gods who watched over the world. And through this sacred fire, they discovered something hidden in the rocks of their mountains: metal. At first, it was copper, one of the earliest metals to be shaped by human hands. When hammered, it could form ornaments, tools, and simple weapons. Later, they learned to combine copper with tin to create bronze, a much stronger alloy that spread across the ancient Near East. Bronze fueled armies, agriculture, and craftsmanship for centuries. It became the backbone of what historians now call the Bronze Age. But bronze, for all its strength, depended on tin, a resource that was rare and often far away. The Hittites, surrounded by rich mineral deposits in Anatolia, began experimenting with another material: iron. It was harder to extract, more stubborn under the flame, and at first seemed unremarkable. Yet, when mastered, iron revealed itself to be stronger, more abundant, and more enduring than bronze. This discovery would change the world. The earliest Hittite iron objects were small: daggers, ornaments, symbolic gifts for kings and gods. They were not yet weapons of mass armies, but they carried immense prestige. To hold iron was to hold a piece of the future. Kings offered it to foreign rulers as diplomatic treasures. In a time when most of the world still relied on bronze, the Hittites quietly nurtured the craft that would soon define a new era: the Iron Age. But the Hittites were not only workers of fire and metal, they were also builders of a kingdom. Around the 17th century BCE, they established their capital at Hattusa, a city that rose from the rocky hills of central Anatolia. Protected by massive stone walls and fortified gates, Hattusa became the heart of a growing empire. Its archives, written on clay tablets in cuneiform script, preserved treaties, laws, myths, and prayers, some of the earliest written records of organized government. From this capital, the Hittites expanded outward. They fought and traded with neighboring peoples, from the Hurrians to the Egyptians. They built roads and networks of communication across their rugged land. But more than anything, they carried with them the secrets of iron. To understand the significance of this moment, we must imagine the world without it. Bronze tools could cut wood and plow fields, but they wore down quickly. Bronze weapons were effective, but they bent and broke under pressure. Iron, once mastered, was tougher, sharper, and longer lasting. An iron plow could cut deeper into the soil, producing more food for growing populations. An iron weapon could hold an edge far longer than its bronze counterpart, giving its wielder a critical advantage in battle. The Hittites' mastery of iron was not just technological, it was cultural. In their religion, metalworking was tied to divine favor. The smith, working at the furnace, was almost a priestly figure, channeling the elemental forces of fire, air, and earth. To create iron was to participate in a sacred act, a ritual that bound humans to gods. But history rarely moves in straight lines. The Hittites' knowledge of iron remained for a time limited and closely guarded. The widespread use of iron would not come until centuries later, after the fall of their empire. Yet the seeds had been planted. The techniques they developed and the symbolic power they attached to iron ensured that their influence outlived them. As the Hittite Empire rose, they became known not only as metalworkers but also as diplomats and warriors. One of the most famous episodes in their history came in 1274 BCE, when they clashed with the Egyptians under Pharaoh Ramses II at the Battle of Kadesh. Though this moment belongs to a later episode of their story, it serves as a reminder. The Hittites were a force respected across the ancient world, and their mastery of iron was part of the reason why. When we look back at the origins of the Iron Age, we often see it as a turning point, a moment when humanity gained a tool that reshaped economies, armies, and daily life. Yet, it was not a sudden revolution. It was the result of centuries of careful observation, of fire tended in furnaces, of ore hammered into shape, of kings who recognized the power hidden in the earth beneath their feet. The Hittites, more than any other early people, embodied this transition. Thus, the beginning of their story is not only the tale of a people in Anatolia, but also the story of how humankind first unlocked one of nature's deepest secrets. The flame that burned in Hittite forges was the same flame that lit the path toward the modern world. And so, the people of fire and iron began their journey, a journey that would see them rise to power, influence great empires, face crises, and leave behind a legacy that still echoes in the steel and iron of our own age. After centuries of trial, fire, and discovery, the Hittites entered what historians often call their classical period, the time when their kingdom matured into a great empire, standing shoulder to shoulder with Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria. It was a time of expansion, diplomacy, and cultural flowering. The once rugged tribes of Anatolia had transformed into a sophisticated power whose reach extended across the ancient Near East. At the heart of this transformation was Hattusa, their capital. Perched high in the hills of central Anatolia, Hattusa was more than just a city. It was a statement of strength and identity. Its walls stretched for kilometers, reinforced with massive stone blocks and decorated with symbolic gates, most famously the Lion Gate and the King SS Gate, where sculpted guardians stood watch over all who entered. Within its walls lay temples, palaces, and archives filled with clay tablets that recorded the rhythms of administration, law, and belief. The political system of the Hittites was unusual compared to other ancient empires. The king, often called the Great King, was the supreme ruler, but he did not govern alone. Alongside him stood the Pancus, an assembly or council of nobles and officials who could advise and even challenge the king's authority. This balance gave the Hittite state a structure that was both strong and flexible. Kingship was sacred, yet it was also shared with a network of elites who ensured stability. One of the most important rulers of this era was Suppiluliuma the Kern, who reigned in the 14th century BCE. Under his leadership, the Hittites expanded dramatically. Suppiluliuma was both a skilled warrior and a shrewd diplomat. He forged treaties, negotiated marriages, and at the same time, led campaigns that extended Hittite influence into Syria and beyond. His reign marked the beginning of the Hittites' true imperial strength, allowing them to rival Egypt itself. But empire is never just about kings and battles. It is also about how people live, work, and believe. The Hittite economy was rooted in agriculture. Farmers cultivated wheat, barley, grapes, and olives, supported by irrigation systems that tamed the challenging Anatolian landscape. Herding sheep and cattle provided wool, milk, and meat, while horses, so prized in Hittite culture, became symbols of power and key assets in their military strength. Trade was another lifeline. The Hittites sat at a crossroads of the ancient world. From the east came tin and precious stones. From the west came copper and silver. From the south, through Syria and Mesopotamia, came luxury goods, textiles, and spices. Caravans traveled overland routes while rivers served as arteries of exchange. Hattusa itself became a marketplace of cultures, where merchants and envoys from distant lands mingled. This movement of goods was matched by a movement of ideas. The Hittites absorbed influences from their neighbors but also contributed their own. Their religion, for instance, was a vast tapestry of deities. They worshipped 1,000 gods, from the storm god Tarhunt to the sun goddess Arina. Yet when they encountered new cultures, they often adopted foreign gods into their own pantheon. This inclusiveness reflected not weakness, but strength, an empire that could embrace diversity without losing its identity. In the realm of law, the Hittites developed a code that reflected both severity and mercy. Their laws, preserved on clay tablets, covered property rights, family matters, and crimes. Unlike the harsh punishments found in some neighboring cultures, Hittite law often allowed for compensation or restitution rather than extreme penalties. This revealed a society that valued order but also recognized the complexities of human life. Culturally, the Hittites blended practicality with symbolism. Their art, often carved into stone reliefs, depicted kings, gods, and animals with a sense of both realism and spirituality. Their language, recorded in cuneiform script, has become a treasure for modern historians. In fact, the Hittite language is today recognized as the oldest known member of the Indo-European family, the same linguistic family that would later produce Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and eventually English. In this sense, the voices of the Hittites still echo in the very words we speak. Yet perhaps the most defining feature of their classical period was diplomacy. The Hittites were not only warriors but also negotiators of extraordinary skill. The archives of Hattusa contain hundreds of treaties, agreements, and letters exchanged with foreign powers. The most famous example came after the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE. Though the battle itself ended in a stalemate, the aftermath produced the world's earliest known international peace treaty between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II. Inscribed on clay tablets and carved on Egyptian temples, this treaty spoke of mutual respect, alliance, and shared security. It stands as a remarkable testament to the Hittites' ability to transform conflict into cooperation. This diplomatic brilliance was matched by their innovation in military organization. Hittite armies were renowned for their chariots, which became powerful symbols of both technology and prestige. Unlike lighter Egyptian chariots, Hittite chariots were built for stability, carrying 3 men instead of 2, a driver, a warrior, and a shield-bearer. This gave them endurance and power in battle, a reflection of their mastery over horses and iron. Still, the empire was not invincible. Its vast territories required constant management, and local governors often had to balance loyalty to the great king with their own ambitions. The system worked, but it was delicate, dependent on the strength and wisdom of its rulers. As the classical period unfolded, the Hittites stood as one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age world. They were respected, sometimes feared, but always significant. Their capital buzzed with activity. Their fields yielded harvests. Their forges glowed with fire, and their scribes pressed knowledge into clay. They were no longer just a people of Anatolia. They were an empire whose influence reached across continents. When we think of the Hittites' classical age, it is easy to imagine the noise of Hattusa's streets, the clatter of chariots, the hum of marketplaces, the chanting of priests in temple courtyards and the scratching of scribes in royal archives. It was an age when the Hittites carved their name into history, not only with iron, but with ideas, words, and agreements that outlasted their walls. The legacy of this period is not simply the expansion of an empire, but the maturity of a civilization. The Hittites demonstrated that true power came not only from weapons, but also from laws, diplomacy, and culture. This was their classical era, the high point of their story, when the people of fire and iron became one of the defining forces of the ancient world. The Hittites did not rise in isolation. No great civilization ever does. Their empire, though strong and independent, was deeply shaped by the currents of the wider world. Trade, religion, diplomacy, and conflict all brought foreign ideas to Anatolia. In turn, the Hittites absorbed, adapted, and often transformed these influences into something uniquely their own. To understand the outside influences on the Hittites, we must first look at their geography. Anatolia, their homeland, was a crossroads. To the south lay the wealthy lands of Syria and Mesopotamia, with their ancient cities of Babylon and Nineveh. To the east stretched the mountains of Armenia and the Iranian plateau. To the west, beyond rugged hills, lay the Aegean world, home to early Greek cultures such as the Mycenaeans. To the north was the Black Sea, a gateway to mysterious tribes and mineral wealth. This position, right at the intersection of east and west, made the Hittites both vulnerable and powerful. They were constantly exposed to new people, goods, and ideas. One of the earliest and most lasting influences came from Mesopotamia. Long before the Hittites forged their empire, Mesopotamia had already given the world writing, urban life, and law codes. The Hittites adopted the cuneiform script from the Akkadians, using clay tablets to record their laws, treaties, and correspondence. Through this adoption, the Hittites preserved thousands of documents that today provide us with a vivid picture of their world. Yet they did not merely copy, they reshaped the script to fit their own Indo-European language, leaving behind a priceless linguistic bridge between East and West. Religion, too, bore the mark of foreign influence. The Hittite pantheon was famously vast. 1,000 gods, as they liked to call it. Many of these deities were borrowed from neighboring cultures. From the Hurrians of the east came storm gods and goddesses of fertility. From Mesopotamia came figures of the underworld and solar deities. From the Luwians and other Anatolian peoples came local mountain gods and river spirits. Instead of rejecting these foreign gods, the Hittites welcomed them. They saw the divine as a universal force expressed in many forms, and by adopting foreign gods, they also acknowledged and integrated the cultures of conquered peoples. This openness extended into law and governance. While the Hittites had their own codes, they were influenced by earlier Mesopotamian traditions such as the Code of Hammurabi. Yet again, the Hittites softened what they inherited. Where Babylonian law might demand severe punishment, the Hittite system often allowed compensation or exile. This blending of strict foreign influence with native pragmatism created a legal tradition that was both respected and adaptable. Another crucial outside influence came through trade and commerce. The Hittites lived in a land rich with metals, iron, copper, and silver. But they lacked tin, the vital ingredient for making bronze. This scarcity pushed them into long-distance trade networks that stretched as far as Afghanistan, where tin was mined. In return, the Hittites exported their metals, timber, and agricultural products. Through these exchanges, foreign merchants and caravans brought not only goods but also stories, customs, and technologies into Hittite lands. The most dramatic outside influence, however, came from direct contact with rival powers. Egypt was perhaps the most famous of these. The Egyptians and Hittites clashed over control of Syria, a region rich in trade routes and cities. The culmination of this rivalry was the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, one of the most famous military encounters of the ancient world. Though the battle itself was indecisive, its aftermath produced a peace treaty between the two powers, the first known international treaty in history. This document, preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, demonstrated not only the influence of Egypt on Hittite politics, but also the growing culture of diplomacy in the late Bronze Age. Beyond Egypt, the Assyrians also influenced the Hittites. The Assyrians were a rising force in Mesopotamia, known for their efficiency and military might. The Hittites traded and sometimes competed with them, learning from their administrative systems and incorporating aspects of their communication networks. Clay tablets found in Hattusa reveal diplomatic correspondence with Assyrian kings, showing how these powers influenced each other through both rivalry and cooperation. The Mycenaeans, early Greeks from across the Aegean, also touched Hittite history. Records in Hittite archives mention a land called Ahiyawa, which many scholars believe refers to the Achaeans, the very people celebrated in Homer's epics centuries later. These interactions hint at a fascinating connection between the Hittites and the Greek world. Some historians even suggest that conflicts described in Greek legend, such as the Trojan War, may have roots in disputes involving the Hittites and their western neighbors. Through all of these exchanges, the Hittites proved themselves to be skilled adapters. They took foreign influences and wove them into their own cultural fabric. They borrowed writing from Mesopotamia but used it to record their Indo-European language. They adopted foreign gods but gave them Hittite names and roles. They absorbed trade goods and technologies but directed them toward their own economic growth. Far from being overwhelmed, the Hittites thrived precisely because they were open to influence. This ability to integrate outside ideas was one of the reasons the Hittite Empire endured for centuries. It created a culture that was both deeply rooted in Anatolia and cosmopolitan in spirit. Hattusa itself became a mirror of this. A city where Egyptian envoys, Babylonian scribes, Syrian merchants, and Mycenaean traders might all be found walking its streets. Yet outside influence was not always gentle. It brought opportunities, but also challenges. Rival empires pressed on Hittite borders. Foreign gods complicated their religious order. Imported luxuries created social inequalities. As much as outside influences enriched the Hittites, they also set the stage for tensions and struggles that would one day test the empire's resilience. Still, in their classical period, the Hittites managed to transform these challenges into strength. They proved that a civilization could be both proud of its roots and open to the world. They demonstrated that influence did not mean weakness, but growth. When we step back, we can see the Hittites as a reflection of the ancient world itself, a world already interconnected, already global in its exchanges, long before the modern age. Their story reminds us that civilizations are not isolated islands, but living tapestries woven from many threads. The Hittites wove their tapestry well, and for a time it shone brightly at the center of the ancient Near East. But, as with all great powers, the outside world would eventually bring not only inspiration, but also crisis. That, however, belongs to the next chapter in their long and fascinating journey. Civilizations reach their height not merely through conquest, but through periods of steady growth. Moments when knowledge, technology, economy, and governance advance together. For the Hittites, this period arrived in the 13th century BCE, during what many historians call their imperial zenith. It was the age when the people of fire and iron became a dominant power in the Near East, shaping trade routes, diplomacy, and warfare on a scale that echoed far beyond their rugged Anatolian homeland. The expansion of technology. At the heart of Hittite growth was their innovation with iron and chariotry. Although iron had been known in earlier centuries, it was during this period that the Hittites began refining its use in tools and weapons. Their smiths experimented with techniques of smelting, hammering, and tempering, producing stronger, more reliable objects than the bronze tools of their neighbors. While iron was not yet widespread in daily life, bronze remained common for farming and crafts. Iron objects carried symbolic and strategic weight. A Hittite king gifting an iron dagger to a foreign ruler was offering not just a weapon, but a token of prestige, a statement of mastery over the earth's hidden strength. These gifts became instruments of diplomacy, as valuable as treaties themselves. Equally significant was the chariot, which the Hittites perfected into a formidable weapon of war. Unlike the lighter Egyptian chariots, which carried 2 men, Hittite chariots were larger, carrying 3, a driver, a warrior, and a shield-bearer. This made them slower but far more stable and durable in combat. In large numbers, they became the armored vehicles of the late Bronze Age battlefield, symbols of Hittite technological ingenuity. The growth of economy and trade. As technology advanced, so too did the economy. The Hittite Empire lay across a natural crossroads of trade. From the east came tin and lapis lazuli. From the south came luxury textiles, cedarwood, and spices. From the west came copper and gold. And from the north along the Black Sea came iron ore and other raw materials. The Hittites controlled many of the overland routes that linked these regions, making their empire not only a political power but also a commercial hub. Agriculture thrived in the fertile valleys and plains of Anatolia. Wheat and barley fields supported both the population and the armies, while vineyards and olive groves added richness to their diet and economy. Horses, so vital for their chariot corps, were bred and trained in specialized royal stables, where they were treated as symbols of prestige and strategic assets. The Hittite kings also oversaw tribute and taxation systems. Conquered regions provided grain, livestock, and labor, ensuring that Hattusa and other major cities were supplied even in times of hardship. This steady flow of resources allowed the empire to sustain its military campaigns and monumental building projects. Political stability and organization. Growth required not only resources but also stability. The Hittites achieved this through a sophisticated political system. At its center was the great king, who ruled with both secular and sacred authority. Yet the king was supported by a complex bureaucracy of governors, officials, and scribes. Provinces were overseen by trusted vassals, often members of the royal family, who pledged loyalty in exchange for autonomy. The Hittites also excelled in the art of treaty-making. They bound neighboring states to them through carefully negotiated agreements. These treaties, preserved in clay tablets, often began with a recital of past relations, then outlined mutual obligations, and ended with invocations of the gods as witnesses. This combination of law, religion, and politics made treaties not just contracts but sacred promises. This system of governance allowed the Hittites to manage a vast and diverse territory, from the mountains of Anatolia to the plains of Syria. By blending authority with diplomacy, they maintained stability while expanding their influence. Cultural flourishing. The Age of Growth was also a time of cultural richness. The Hittites' adoption and adaptation of foreign gods led to a dynamic and inclusive religion. In Hattusa, massive temples dedicated to the storm god and the sun goddess stood as centers of worship and ceremony. Religious festivals marked the calendar, bringing communities together in shared rituals of renewal and thanksgiving. Art and architecture reflected both power and spirituality. Stone reliefs depicted kings embracing deities, processions of gods, and sacred animals. Fortified walls and monumental gates proclaimed the might of the empire, while palaces displayed the wealth of their rulers. Even in the smaller artifacts, seals, jewelry, pottery, we see the careful craftsmanship of a society that valued both function and beauty. Language and literature also grew in significance. The archives of Hattusa contained thousands of tablets not only in Hittite, but also in Akkadian, Hurrian, and other languages. These included myths, prayers, legal codes, and diplomatic correspondence. Through these texts, we glimpse a society deeply engaged with both the practical needs of governance and the spiritual needs of faith. The Hittites in the wider world. During this age, the Hittites became one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, alongside Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. They engaged in alliances, rivalries, and exchanges that shaped the region. The Battle of Kadesh against Egypt, though technically part of their struggles, was also a defining moment of this growth period. It demonstrated the scale of their military power and their ability to negotiate on equal terms with Egypt, the wealthiest empire of the age. The peace treaty that followed, an agreement of mutual respect and cooperation, cemented the Hittites' place on the global stage. Their kings corresponded with pharaohs, queens, and foreign rulers, using diplomacy as effectively as warfare to secure their empire's position. The role of iron in history. What makes this period truly significant is not only what the Hittites achieved in their own time, but also the legacy they prepared for the future. By mastering ironworking, even in its early stages, they paved the way for the Iron Age that would follow the collapse of the Bronze Age world. Though the widespread use of iron came later, the Hittites' innovations ensured that their name would always be linked with the birth of a new era in human history, a civilization at its height. The Age of Growth was the moment when the Hittites shone brightest. Their fields were fertile, their forges glowed, their chariots thundered across battlefields, and their treaties carried weight in courts far beyond Anatolia. It was an age when the people of fire and iron seemed destined to endure forever. And yet, history reminds us that no empire is eternal. The very connections that enriched the Hittites, their trade routes, their diplomatic ties, their reliance on distant resources, would also expose them to risks. Famine, invasion, and shifting powers loomed on the horizon. For now, however, we remember the 13th century BCE as the Hittites' great moment of prosperity, a period when they stood proudly among the giants of the ancient world. Every great empire eventually meets its shadows. For the Hittites, the 13th century BCE began as an age of triumph and prosperity, but by its closing decades, storm clouds gathered over Anatolia and Syria. The empire that had grown through innovation, diplomacy, and military strength now faced challenges that seemed to come from every direction at once: drought, rebellion, shifting trade networks, and relentless external threats. Historians call this the Late Bronze Age collapse, but for the Hittites, it was first and foremost an age of crisis. The foundations of empire begin with the soil. For centuries, the farmlands of Anatolia had provided the grain, barley, and livestock that sustained the Hittite heartland. Yet evidence from climate studies, combined with ancient texts, points to a period of prolonged drought and famine beginning in the late 13th century BCE. In the royal archives, tablets record pleas from provincial governors and vassal kings. The storehouses are empty, the fields yield nothing. Send grain, or my people will perish. Such letters reveal a system under stress. The great kings of Hattusa, once providers of abundance, now struggled to feed their subjects. Relief shipments were sent to starving regions, but the empire's own reserves grew thin. Without fertile harvests, armies could not march, cities could not thrive, and loyalty could not be guaranteed. Hunger bred unrest. The empire's strength, built on agriculture, began to weaken. While famine gnawed from within, enemies pressed from without. To the west, in the rugged lands of Arzawa and beyond, small kingdoms tested their strength against Hittite authority. To the north, the Kaska tribes, long a thorn in Hittite history, harassed the empire's frontiers with raids and ambushes. Though never forming a kingdom of their own, the Kaska were relentless, exploiting every weakness of the Hittite military. To the east, Assyria was rising. Once a minor power under Hittite dominance, Assyria grew bolder in the late 13th century, launching campaigns that challenged Hittite influence in northern Mesopotamia. For the first time in generations, the Hittites faced a rival whose military might could equal their own. And to the south came the most mysterious threat of all: the Sea Peoples. These groups, whose exact origins remain debated, surged across the eastern Mediterranean. They attacked coastal cities, disrupted trade routes, and left devastation in their wake. For an empire like the Hittites, so dependent on connections across the sea and land, the chaos of the Sea Peoples struck at the core of their economic survival. The very success of the Hittite Empire became its burden. At its height, the empire stretched from Anatolia to northern Syria, encompassing dozens of cities, cultures, and vassal states. Managing such a vast territory required constant vigilance, diplomacy, and resources. But in the age of crisis, the system began to falter. Vassals who had once sworn loyalty now saw weakness in Hattusa and turned to rebellion or defection. Treaties that had bound allies with sacred oaths were broken when survival was at stake. The great king's letters reveal a tone of desperation, urging allies to remain faithful while promising supplies that often never arrived. The central government itself strained under the pressure. Successive kings faced not only foreign wars but also internal rivalries within the royal family. Succession disputes, long a feature of Hittite politics, now erupted into open conflict, further destabilizing the empire at its weakest moment. The capital city of Hattusa, once a bustling heart of administration, diplomacy, and ceremony, began to show signs of stress. Archaeological evidence suggests parts of the city were abandoned in these years, while defensive works were hastily reinforced. The once proud palaces and temples struggled to maintain their grandeur as resources dwindled. Clay tablets from the archives become scarcer toward the end of the 13th century, as if the scribes themselves could no longer keep pace with the unraveling order. What had once been the voice of an empire now spoke in fragmented whispers. Behind the politics and battles lay the human suffering of ordinary people. Farmers watched their crops wither under a merciless sun. Traders found once profitable routes cut off by war or piracy. Soldiers marched endlessly to defend crumbling borders, often unpaid and underfed. Families were uprooted as villages were burned or abandoned. For the common people, the age of crisis was not measured in treaties or dynasties, but in empty granaries, lost loved ones, and the slow erosion of the security that empire had once promised. Despite the darkness, the Hittites did not collapse overnight. Kings like Tudhaliya IV and Suppiluliuma Tseun fought fiercely to preserve the empire. They launched campaigns against rebellious vassals, sought alliances through marriage, and even attempted naval warfare against the Sea Peoples. Suppiluliuma II, the last known king of Hatti, left inscriptions boasting of victories at sea, a testament to resilience even in decline. Yet these victories were fleeting. Each triumph was followed by new threats, each recovery by fresh setbacks. The empire was trapped in a cycle of crisis from which it could not escape. By the early 12th century BCE, the empire had reached a breaking point. The combination of famine, invasion, rebellion, and internal strife proved too much to bear. One by one, the Hittite cities fell. Trade networks collapsed. Diplomatic ties disintegrated. And somewhere around 1200 BCE, Hattusa itself was abandoned and burned, its great walls left to crumble into silence. This moment marked not only the end of the Hittite Empire but also the end of an age. Across the eastern Mediterranean, other great powers, Mycenae, Ugarit, Egypt, also faced crisis, though some endured longer than others. The collapse of the Hittites was part of a broader transformation, a storm that reshaped the ancient world. The age of crisis reminds us that civilizations are not only measured by their achievements, but also by their struggles. The Hittites, once masters of iron and diplomacy, could not withstand the combined weight of climate, war, and human ambition. Yet even in collapse, their legacy endured. The treaties they wrote influenced later legal traditions. Their early mastery of iron foreshadowed the future. Their memory, preserved in fragments, continues to teach us about resilience and fragility in the face of history's storms. For the Hittites, the age of growth had given way to the age of crisis, and soon crisis would lead to silence. The decline of the Hittite Empire had been long in the making, but collapse, when it came, was swift and irreversible. Around 1200 BCE, one of the most powerful kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age vanished almost without trace. No triumphant successor recorded their conquest in detail. No annals of glory chronicled their final stand. Instead, silence fell over Anatolia, and the once mighty capital of Hattusa was reduced to ruins. This is the story of how an empire that had stood for centuries came to its end. At the center of the last act stood Suppiluliuma II, remembered as the final great king of the Hittite Empire. He inherited not a flourishing realm, but a fractured kingdom beset by crisis. Famine lingered, rebellions simmered, enemies pressed at every border. Yet Suppiluliuma did not simply accept decline. His inscriptions, carved on stone, proclaim bold campaigns against rivals and seaborne enemies. In fact, he is credited with leading one of the earliest recorded naval battles in history, fighting against enemies near Cyprus. For a landlocked Anatolian power, this was a remarkable adaptation, showing just how desperate the times had become. Still, despite such efforts, his reign could not halt the unraveling. Victories at sea could not feed starving cities. Armies could no longer be sustained. The empire was being eaten away from within as much as from without. Archaeology tells a haunting tale of the final decades. Across Anatolia and northern Syria, once prosperous Hittite centers show signs of sudden destruction or abandonment. Cities like Tarhuntasa and Karkemish, once vital administrative hubs, fell into chaos. Some were burned, others were deserted, their walls left to crumble as people fled. Hattusa itself, the capital that had once stood as the heartbeat of the empire, suffered the same fate. Excavations reveal that the city was deliberately abandoned and set aflame. The grand temples, the sprawling palaces, the archives of clay tablets, all reduced to ashes. Whether the destruction came from invading forces or desperate inhabitants is still debated. What is clear is that Hattusa ceased to exist as the capital of a living kingdom. The silence that followed is almost eerie. For centuries, Hattusa had been the center of diplomacy and power, sending letters to Egypt and Assyria, commanding vassal kings, and ruling a vast territory. After 1200 BCE, no new records were written there. The voice of Hatti was gone. One of the enduring mysteries of this collapse is the role of the Sea Peoples. These enigmatic groups swept through the eastern Mediterranean during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, attacking ports, burning cities, and destabilizing kingdoms. Egyptian records vividly describe battles against them, portraying them as a force of chaos. Did they march against the Hittites directly? The evidence is unclear. Some scholars argue that their raids devastated Hittite trade routes, cutting off essential supplies. Others believe the Sea Peoples may have joined with local rebels, adding to the pressure on an already fragile empire. What we know is this: the Hittite fall was not an isolated event. Across the region, other great powers faced the same storm. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece were destroyed. Ugarit, a thriving port in Syria, was burned and never rebuilt. Egypt itself survived, but only after fierce battles. The Hittites were not alone in collapse, but they were among the greatest to vanish completely. Beneath the battles and politics, famine continued to gnaw at the empire. Letters from the final decades reveal heartbreaking pleas. One such tablet records a desperate request for grain. "If you do not send it, we will die." Another describes ships dispatched to bring food from abroad, only to be lost or intercepted. Imagine the daily life of ordinary people in this era. Fields lay barren after years of drought. Families abandoned their farms in search of survival, moving to cities already strained beyond capacity. Soldiers fought not only enemies, but hunger itself. In a society that had once prided itself on abundance and ritual feasting, the specter of starvation became ever present. This hunger weakened loyalty. Vassals who could no longer rely on Hattusa's support chose independence instead. Communities once bound to the empire fractured, each seeking survival in its own way. By the early 12th century BCE, the Hittite Empire no longer existed as a united state. Suppiluliuma II's name is the last we know in the line of great kings. After him, the record falls silent. No grand conquest is recorded, no final treaty, no clear successor. The empire dissolved into fragments. Yet not all was lost. In the aftermath, small Neo-Hittite states emerged in southern Anatolia and northern Syria, places like Carchemish, Melide, and Kumu. These smaller kingdoms carried on elements of Hittite culture, language, and tradition for centuries, long after the fall of Hattusa. Though no longer an empire, the Hittite spirit survived in pockets, influencing the cultures that followed. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the Hittite fall is how completely they vanished from memory. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, whose monuments kept their stories alive, the Hittites disappeared into silence. For nearly 3,000 years, their empire was forgotten. When later civilizations looked back at the Late Bronze Age, they scarcely mentioned Hatti. Even the Bible, written long after their fall, refers to the Hittites in scattered, confusing ways, with little sense of their true power. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Hattusa and deciphered the cuneiform tablets, that the Hittites re-emerged from obscurity. What had once been one of the great empires of the world was rediscovered as if for the first time. The fall of the Hittite Empire is more than an ancient tragedy. It is a reminder of how fragile civilizations can be. Even the strongest kingdoms, with their armies, treaties, and innovations, are vulnerable to the forces of nature, shifting alliances, and human ambition. The Hittites mastered iron, pioneered international diplomacy, and built an empire that stood for centuries. Yet in the span of a few decades, all of it was undone. Their fall marks the end of the Bronze Age world and the beginning of a new, harsher age of transition. And so the story of the Hittites closes not with a single battle or a glorious victory, but with silence, fire, and disappearance. Their legacy, buried beneath the earth, would wait 3,000 years to be told again. When the fire in Hattusa burned out and the last great king faded into silence, the world of the Hittites did not end completely. Though the empire was gone, shattered by famine, invasions, and collapse, its memory lived on, not in the halls of power, but in the smaller kingdoms that rose from its ashes. This is the story of the Neo-Hittite states, the fragments of an empire that refused to vanish entirely. After 1200 BCE, central Anatolia, once the proud heart of the empire, lay largely abandoned. The capital was destroyed, the royal line extinguished, and the great temples silent. But in the south, where the land was more fertile and trade routes still pulsed with life, the Hittite legacy endured. Here, in the regions of Cilicia, northern Syria, and southeastern Anatolia, new city-states emerged. They were smaller, weaker, and more vulnerable than the empire had been, but they carried forward the culture of Hatti. Cities like Carchemish, Melide, modern Malatya, and Kumu rose as heirs to the fallen empire. Their kings styled themselves with old Hittite titles, maintained Hittite rituals, and spoke languages rooted in the Hittite tongue. Stone monuments and inscriptions show that they remembered their ancestors, even as the world around them changed. Among these Neo-Hittite states, Carchemish stood out as the most powerful. Situated on the banks of the Euphrates River, it had long been a key city in the Hittite Empire. When Hattusa fell, Carchemish became the natural refuge for Hittite elites. Evidence suggests that members of the royal family and administrative class fled south to Carchemish, bringing with them the knowledge of government, religion, and writing. For a time, Carchemish kept alive the grandeur of Hatti. Its kings claimed descent from the great kings of the past, a bold assertion meant to remind neighbors that though the empire was gone, the bloodline endured. The city flourished as a center of trade and diplomacy. Its location on the Euphrates made it a gateway between Anatolia and Mesopotamia, and caravans continued to pass through its markets. Relief carvings from Carchemish show processions of kings, gods, and warriors, images that echo the traditions of the empire yet with new local flavors. One of the remarkable features of the Neo-Hittite world was the persistence of Luwian hieroglyphs. While cuneiform had been the official script of the empire, in the aftermath it was the native Anatolian script, pictorial symbols carved into stone, that endured. Across southern Anatolia and Syria, monumental inscriptions appear in these hieroglyphs. They record royal names, victories, religious dedications, and lineages. They remind us that, even in decline, these small kingdoms wanted to be remembered. The language they spoke was a blend. Hittite traditions mingled with Luwian and local tongues. This fusion reflected their new reality, no longer a single empire, but a patchwork of states navigating survival in a dangerous world. If the Hittite Empire had once stood as a giant among giants, the Neo-Hittite states lived in a very different landscape. By the early 1st millennium BCE, two new superpowers were rising, Assyria to the east and Aram to the south. The Neo-Hittite cities found themselves caught between these growing empires. Sometimes they resisted, raising armies and fortifying walls. More often, they submitted, becoming vassals or tributary states. Their kings paid homage to stronger rulers, hoping to preserve their fragile independence. For nearly 4 centuries, these small kingdoms survived by diplomacy, adaptation, and endurance. But they always lived under the shadow of larger powers. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Assyria's expansion became impossible to resist. The Assyrian kings, fierce, relentless, and ambitious, saw the Neo-Hittite states not as equals, but as obstacles. Campaign after campaign pushed westward into Anatolia and Syria. Neo-Hittite cities were besieged, their rulers forced to swear loyalty, their treasures carried off to Nineveh or Ashur. Assyrian inscriptions boast of these conquests, listing Carchemish, Kumu, and Melid among their triumphs. Yet even in defeat, the Neo-Hittite legacy did not vanish immediately. Assyria absorbed their artistry, their gods, and their iconography. Stone reliefs from this era show a blending of styles, Assyrian power carved in the shapes of Hittite tradition. By the 7th century BCE, the Neo-Hittite states had disappeared as independent powers. Assyria ruled the land, and soon even Assyria itself would fall to Babylon and Persia. But the Hittite spirit left traces that endured. The worship of storm gods, so central to Hittite religion, spread into the cults of neighboring peoples. Artistic motifs, lions, winged figures, processions of deities, continued to appear in later cultures. Even the Luwian hieroglyphs, once the script of forgotten cities, influenced writing systems in the region. In a way, the Hittites never fully died. Their empire was gone, but their culture had seeded itself across the Near East. They became one of the hidden ancestors of later civilizations. For millennia, however, the Hittites were forgotten. The Neo-Hittite states themselves eventually faded from memory, their names erased by new empires. To the Greeks, Persians, and Romans who later controlled Anatolia, the Hittites were little more than a rumor. It was not until the 19th century, when explorers uncovered strange hieroglyphs in Turkey and Syria, that the story of the Neo-Hittites began to re-emerge. Archaeologists puzzled over the symbols carved into stone lions and gateways, slowly piecing together the lost legacy. Carchemish, in particular, became a key site of rediscovery. Excavations there revealed palaces, inscriptions, and reliefs that illuminated the transition from empire to fragments. What had been nearly erased from history began to take shape again. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms remind us of something profound, that civilizations rarely disappear in an instant. Even after catastrophe, fragments endure, sometimes in smaller forms, sometimes transformed, but still alive. The Hittite Empire collapsed in fire and famine, yet its traditions lived on for centuries through Carchemish, Melid, and other cities. and through them, echoes of the Hittites reached into Assyria, Babylon, and beyond. Their survival was not glorious nor filled with triumphs. It was survival through adaptation, compromise, and resilience. In that way, the Neo-Hittite states are just as fascinating as the empire itself. For centuries, the Hittites were nothing but a whisper. Ancient Egyptian records mentioned a mysterious people called the Hatti, rivals who fought battles against pharaohs. The Hebrew Bible spoke of the Hittites as a nation in the land of Canaan. But beyond these faint echoes, the world knew nothing. The empire that once ruled Anatolia had disappeared so completely that scholars doubted it had ever existed. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, whose ruins stood proudly above the sands, the Hittites left behind no monuments that were easily recognized. Their capital lay buried, their language forgotten, their gods silent. And so, for nearly 3,000 years, the Hittites were a civilization erased. By the 17th century, European scholars studying the Bible puzzled over the references to Hittites. Who were they? Where had they lived? Some thought they were a small Canaanite tribe, others believed the name had been confused with another people. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the hieroglyphic inscriptions carved on temple walls told of Pharaoh Ramses II fighting a powerful enemy at the Battle of Kadesh. The enemy was the great king of Hatti. But who was this great king? No one could say. The mystery deepened when Assyrian and Babylonian tablets, unearthed in Mesopotamia during the 19th century, mentioned treaties and wars with the Hittites as though they were equals. How could a people important enough to rival Egypt and Assyria vanish without a trace? The story of rediscovery began with travelers and explorers in the Ottoman Empire. In the early 1800s, European adventurers reported strange ruins scattered across central Turkey. Massive stone lions guarded gateways. Walls were decorated with unusual symbols. One of the most famous discoveries came at Bogazköy, modern Boğazkale. In 1834, French explorer Charles Texier stumbled upon vast ruins in the hills of central Anatolia. He saw city walls stretching across the landscape, gates with sculpted lions and sphinxes, and traces of monumental buildings. But no one knew what city this had been. Texier guessed it might be the capital of some forgotten people, but he could not say who. At the same time, other travelers in northern Syria found inscriptions carved into stone using strange hieroglyphs, not Egyptian, not Mesopotamian, but something different. Scholars began to suspect these might belong to the same unknown culture. By the mid-19th century, archaeologists had identified a peculiar script carved across Anatolia and Syria. The symbols looked like pictures: birds, faces, tools, animals. They were clearly a form of writing, but no one could read them. These Anatolian hieroglyphs, as they were called, became one of the great puzzles of archaeology. They were unlike the cuneiform of Mesopotamia or the hieroglyphs of Egypt. For decades, no one could decipher their meaning. Some scholars believed they belonged to the mysterious Hittites of the Bible. Others dismissed the idea, arguing that the Hittites could never have been powerful enough to leave such ruins. The turning point came in the early 20th century. German archaeologists began systematic excavations at Bogazköy, the site Charles Texier had once visited. What they uncovered was astonishing. Behind the city walls lay the remains of a sprawling capital. Palaces, temples, storage rooms, and fortifications spread across the hills. Most important of all, the archaeologists discovered thousands upon thousands of clay tablets written in cuneiform script. This was no ordinary city. It was the seat of an empire. The tablets were sent to scholars for study, but they were written in a language no one recognized. It seemed to be Indo-European, related to Latin and Greek, yet older and entirely unique. In 1915, Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný made the breakthrough. By carefully analyzing the grammar and vocabulary, he realized the tablets were written in the language of the Hittites. At last, the lost empire had a voice again. The decipherment of Hittite language changed everything. Suddenly, historians had direct access to the thoughts, treaties, prayers, and laws of the Hittite world. The tablets told of kings and queens, of wars against Egypt, of alliances with Babylon, of rituals to the storm god, of letters exchanged with pharaohs. They described the grandeur of Hattusa, the administrative power of its scribes, the complex legal system of the empire. No longer a shadow in foreign records, the Hittites emerged as a central power of the late Bronze Age. Excavations also turned to the south, where the Neo-Hittite kingdoms had once thrived. At Carchemish, archaeologists uncovered monumental reliefs, inscriptions, and palaces. British teams, including a young T.E. Lawrence, later famous as Lawrence of Arabia, helped document the site in the early 1900s. The discoveries showed how the culture of the empire survived for centuries after Hattusa's fall. Even as Assyria absorbed them, the memory of the Hittites lived on in stone. By the mid-20th century, the pieces of the puzzle finally connected. The strange hieroglyphs in Anatolia were recognized as Luwian hieroglyphs, used by the Neo-Hittite states. The vast ruins at Bogazkoy were identified as Hattusa, the imperial capital. The treaties mentioned in Mesopotamian archives matched the ones preserved in Hittite tablets. The once-forgotten empire now stood revealed, a great power that had rivaled Egypt, commanded vast armies, and shaped the politics of the ancient Near East. Today, the rediscovery of the Hittites stands as one of archaeology's great triumphs. From silence and obscurity, an entire civilization returned to history. Their language is now recognized as the earliest written Indo-European tongue. Their capital, Hattusa, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Their story is taught alongside Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece. And yet, the rediscovery is also a reminder of how fragile memory can be. For 3,000 years, the Hittites were erased, known only through whispers in the records of others. They could have remained forgotten forever, were it not for explorers, archaeologists, and linguists who pieced together the puzzle. When we stand today among the stone lions of Hattusa, or trace the symbols of the Luwian hieroglyphs, we connect with a people who once stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest powers of their age. The rediscovery of the Hittites is more than a story of archaeology. It is a story of resurrection, a civilization rising again from the silence of the earth. And in that rediscovery, the Hittites reclaimed their place in the grand story of humanity. And so, by the end of this first part, the Hittites had transformed from scattered highland tribes into a kingdom with ambition. But the true weight of their empire, the great wars, the diplomacy, the clashes with Egypt, and their mysterious fall, still lies ahead. Stay with me, as in Part 2, we witness the height of Hittite power, and the silence that followed their collapse.